Hi everybody, Professor Olson here. Again, coming mostly live in the home office. I thought we would discuss chapter 1 a little bit, go over some of these things, therefore you would have a better understanding. I know reading is great, but sometimes it helps to talk things out a little bit in some way, shape, or form. So really, I think we should dive in. If you look at chapter 3 slide, I'm going to put my glasses on so I can see a little bit better. And we'll discuss briefly prehistory. This chapter is focused really on humanity's origins. I'm not so concerned about that. I'm more concerned, of course, about history, but we will do a quick recon, if you will. All right, so Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, all of this leads in some way, apparently, to Homo sapiens, although we still have no link to these. And then, of course, we finally come to humanity, us, Homo sapiens sapiens. Sapiens in the Latin means wise, so we're very, very wise. So we do know that we have evidence Homo sapiens sapiens first appeared between 135,000 and 100,000 years ago. We know about the out of Africa thesis, which postulates that humanity started in Africa and gradually began to spread out and, of course, settle in various areas of the world. I'm making this very quick because you have the book. You know, we're looking a little bit deeper. Some of this you may have had before in previous classes. I don't know your background, so if some of this sounds very familiar, just please bear with us, you know, until we get to things that you haven't seen. The Paleolithic era. So we have new stone, which is the Neolithic, neo for new, lithic for stone, and the Paleolithic. Paleo means old, lithic, of course, means stone again. You are not going to be tested on the years of these. For one thing, they are an estimate. For another thing, this again is not entirely history. It's prehistory. We can conjecture, we can look at the remains, we have no written record. History begins with writing, and we'll talk about writing soon. But we do need to visit our prehistoric ancestors very briefly. So we do know in the beginning, we're looking at communities, they're hunting, they're gathering, they're managing to find what they need within the confines of wherever they are. Based on studies of groups of people living like this in Papua New Guinea, we find that it only takes about 3 to 4 hours for a group of people between 20 and 35 people, which is what these bands would have been, to obtain the necessities of life, which of course leaves plenty of leisure time. So they were making baskets, they were traveling, they were observing, probably new places to find hunting grounds, to find food. So there were times where you could have leisure time. And of course, everyone came together for the good of the community. And everyone had different strengths. So men and women at this point probably had some overlap of roles in terms of how they helped the community. Again, we have no written records, so we can only guess at these things. We do know over time, languages began to develop, and probably very different ones in different regions. And from here, we see the beginnings of what will eventually lead to civilization. We do know with the Neolithic or New Stone period, we begin to see domestication. And this is a game changer, all right? Pottery has long been a help for archaeologists, and of course, as one of my anthropology friends says, archaeology is the handmaiden of history. And with that in mind, think of pottery kind of like your average everyday fridge, all right? Without refrigeration, obviously food would spoil. Now, while pottery does not provide the same benefits, it does preserve food and saves it from pests and vermin. So in a way, Pottery changes everything because now people can store food for later. They don't have to worry about eating it and trying to save it from pests. So suddenly we have these abilities to, because baskets can be porous too, to save food and to preserve it for later. Tools. Your earliest tools are knapped flint. They're actually beating rocks together. Flint splits in very particular ways. It has certain fault lines, and they're able to use it to produce crude but effective tools. And someone finally begins to notice that plants keep coming up in the same place year after year, and that if a plant drops its seeds, you can collect the seeds and use them again, or in some cases eat them. So we start to see the beginning of plant domestication. People begin to realize that they can grow their own food, that they can be in charge of where the food is, that they can manage where the food is. And grapes, grains, and olives, of course, are some of the most important and earliest crops. And they didn't have plows necessarily. We have female skeletons that show once farming began and people began settling, women's roles became more physically intense, and women began to be diminished in some respects as far as societal importance. Men were out with the livestock, men were out hunting. Women, on the other hand, were staying and they were managing the farm. They were managing those plants. And we see repetitive injuries from handling digging sticks and other simple tools that would have been used in order to farm. And over time, of course, animals join humans and begins a wonderful partnership that continues to this day. Dogs are the first to arrive. Dogs are the first ones, and these are clearly from wolves. They are descended from wolves, probably some runts of the litter, some wolves that were rejected or picked up by humans. Dogs evolve or literally are bred really from there. Think of how many different dog breeds exist right now. There's hundreds, if not thousands, all bred for different purposes. By man changing the way these animals looked, they changed their fabric. Same thing with horses and cows. Man began to breed for desirable traits among all these different animals. So dogs are the first to arrive. Sheep, goats, chickens, they're pretty early too, but we can't exactly say exactly which one arrived first. But sheep, of course, provide mutton and they provide wool. Wool is, of course, incredibly important throughout the ancient world. And even today, if you want a nice warm coat, you want a wool one. So sheep are very important. So are goats, for milk and of course, their meat. Oxen, it's determined at some point that if you harness them a certain way, you can begin having them pulling plows. So, of course, oxen will become increasingly important. Cows, of course, for the same reasons we have them today. So, animal domestication continues. The last ones to come to the party, if you will, are horses. At first, horses were hunted for meat. Even today, some Native American tribes within the last 100 years were having horse-eating rituals where the horse was believed to impart certain benefits, or were simply to be used for food, because for many, many years, horses were simply seen as another source of protein. Over time, humans learned that they could use them in partnership. And of course, the last to arrive, who may still be questioning their choice, of course, are cats. Cats are great for, of course, reducing vermin, such as mice and rats. And of course, will help protect grain from these vermin intruders. And of course, it's been a very good partnership. We call this really, when we begin to farm, the agricultural revolution. Please remember that, the agricultural revolution. Now, what do we need for life? We need water, of course, right? Can't live without it for more than a few days. Food you can go without longer. So all of our ancient civilizations, when we get to Sumer, the cradle of civilization, when we get to that Fertile Crescent, it's all about water. All of our ancient civilizations spring up around rivers because it's the source of life. And of course, they need fertile land for planting. They need to have the things that are suitable for humanity to sustain itself. I tell all of my Western Civ classes this. There's a cycle of humanity. When things are going well, and we have access to water, access to food, we're healthy, what happens is it's a cycle of prosperity. People settle down, they begin to be happy, they begin to become more settled, they start to accrue certain benefits, which of course includes over time becoming more populous. So we see an explosion. People are becoming more numerous because they're well fed, they're fertile, they're able to reproduce. Conversely, we see a different cycle. When the water or the food are reduced, humans get sick, and then they get ill, and then they can die. So we have these biological imperatives. So all of our ancient civilizations spring up around rivers. And the first one we need to talk about is in what is now the Near East, or the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, Sumer, located where Iran and Iraq are now. Once upon a time, where the Persian Gulf sits, was a very fertile area. This area, this entire Fertile Crescent, was extremely fertile because you have the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. They're very unpredictable, but what happens is they flood. Not as nicely as the Nile, it's rather violent, but they flood and they're on a plain and one's slightly above the other, and that river runs down into the other, and then they overflow and they leave behind all this gorgeous black topsoil that farmers can use. So we have Sumer. Sumer is a series of city-states that scatter all around this plain. So we have Uruk, we have all these city-states. They're small compared to our current situations, but they are the beginning of civilization. Cuneiform, wedge-shaped writing, will now come into the picture. We will begin to see people keeping records, king's lists, business transactions. In fact, all writing starts as a way to record business transactions, and then of course takes on a life of its own as they begin to find other uses for it. Their buildings are made out of mud with straw inside of it. They actually have forms. They put the mud and the straw together, and the straw reinforces the mud. And when it dries, like pottery, it's sun-fired. It's very strong. And the only problem is, being on a plain, everybody can see each other. And every time a city-state starts to become more prosperous, it starts looking at its neighbors as a possible, shall we say, dessert. They go to war constantly. We also see the stratification of society. Women are staying at home, men are out, and of course we see the stratification of society. It's kind of like a pyramid. Your rulers are at the top, your priests and your nobles are there too, and then as the pyramid continues to expand outward with more and more of the population, we see merchants, we see farmers, and of course, once the concept of war is discovered, prisoners of war, of course, are turned into slaves. And we start to see slavery. Ancient slavery is very different from what you might have remembered from your American history classes. At first, it's prisoners of war, it's criminals, it's people who can't pay their bills. There's actually a high instance of debt slavery in the ancient world. So it was very, very different. And of course, over time, we're going to see slavery really culminate in the Roman Empire. Rome is truly a slave society. All right, so we have this divided labor. People are specializing. The government, some have assemblies, some have an oligarchy, a bunch of noble families, if you will, who are ruling. All right, We see a pretty vast trade network spring up. In time, this will become more and more integrated. All right, cuneiform, of course, gives these officials some power. Your mother was very proud if you went to scribe school, but of course all scribes are male. So they also used to drink their bread. Bread is made out of barley and hops, and of course it's very filling. But this isn't beer the way you might be familiar with it from seeing it, at the local store, or maybe you've seen or drank some of it yourself. This is what we would think more of as small beer. This is very weak beer. And it was very filling for people. And it was very convenient once the brewing was done. All right. I don't want to dwell too much on this. I know you're going to be reading through these slides at your leisure. They're also posted separately for you to go through. But just so you know, Hammurabi creates the first law code that we know of. And of course, justice is very much eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but it's also based on your rank and your class. So if you are wealthy, you are going to be more likely to be excused if your offenses are against the lesser classes. But if it's two nobles, then obviously you will be treated more as equals under the law. There's heavy penalties in this law code. There's not a lot of mercy or in terms of justice. Like nowadays, most of the justice systems in the world have a more merciful bent. Not all, but most. But this is very, very heavy on making sure the penalty fit the crime. All right. And of course, all of our ancient societies that we're going to be examining at the beginning of this class, they're all polytheists. That is, they have many, many gods. Each city-state, in fact, had its own patron god or goddess. All right. And I mentioned how writing becomes more, shall we say, rich, not just about business transactions. The earliest and the greatest work of literature by the Sumerians is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh learns a hard lesson. He learns that immortality is only for the gods, not for mankind. And the way the Mesopotamians or the Sumerians saw the world was that we are all in service to the gods, and the gods' ways are above our own, and we are simply here to be servants, and that's it. And of course, we're going to see in time different worldviews and different philosophies come into human existence. If we go forward, we're going to see that looking at this activity, I'm not too worried about the activity slides, but do pick up on the fact that most of these early city-states depended heavily on farming. Even if you lived in the city, you were dependent on the so-called hinterland, which of course is the area surrounding that city-state where all the farmers would of course be farming the crops. Nowadays, we just go to the grocery store. We don't know where our food comes from. They did. All right, and of course, the other society I want to speak of today is the ancient Egyptian world. We won't get into too much of this, but I do want to draw your attention to slide 10. The way we break down ancient Egyptian society, the way we break down its history, the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. In between each of these is a so-called intermediate period, give or take 100 years, 50 years. These intermediate periods are periods of disarray. They're periods where things don't work properly, where there's unrest. So the Old Kingdom starts with pharaohs, one in Upper Egypt, one in Lower Egypt. By the time of the Middle Kingdom, they are now ruling over a united Egypt. So he is now king of both the Upper and the Lower. And then, of course, the New Kingdom, same thing. But in between, we have these brief intermediate periods where things are difficult. Prior to the Old Kingdom, there was also the Zero Dynasty. Now, the movie is totally inaccurate, but there was an actual Scorpion King. At least that was his nickname or his, title, if you will. And there were a number of other kings that did not rule and become pharaohs and establish dynasties. Egypt has 31 dynasties combined between the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms. All right. The pharaohs, all of them needed bureaucracy, they needed officials, they needed to have a structure so that they could rule. Egypt is an optimistic, happy society, and its population has spread quite far. While each is on 25 miles on either side of the Nile, because after that the topsoil runs out, it's a very happy, optimistic society because the Nile River floods, but it floods gently. You could almost set your watch, had you had one at the time, by it. It's a much different society in terms of its outlook. Sumer was more pessimistic. Egypt is more optimistic because they roughly know when the floods are coming. They roughly know when to expect the topsoil, what their planting season is going to be like. And they have the Nile River, the longest river in the world. So all the gossip, all the news went up and down the river on barges. And on each side, about 25 miles out on each shore, up and down that long, long river was the population. It was a very big population. All right. Now, this is important. Did I mention this might be on your next quiz? Might be. Ma'at. Ma'at. Ma'at is not just the goddess of harmony and justice. She is not just the goddess, but it's also the concept, the ruling concept that Egyptians live by. It's about truth and justice. Supposedly, to get to their paradise, the field of reeds, you have your heart placed on a scale. Ma'at puts her feather on the other side. If your Ma'at, that is your truth and your justice and your sense of fairness during your life, was good, your scales would stay even. However, if you hadn't done everything right, that scale would not line up and you would go to the Egyptian equivalent of the not so good place, the bad place, if you will. So just something to think about. Ma'at as part of their social order, as part of their governing principles. All right. So moving along. All right, the ancient Egyptian world. Again, polytheists for the most part, although there was one pharaoh that tried to change that. Didn't go over so well. And of course, if you've seen the pictures of Anubis, the jackal-headed god, or Bast, my favorite, the cat-headed goddess, then, you've seen a lot of their gods are anthropomorphic, but also have animal tendencies. And they believed that while they did serve the gods, that the gods also wanted them to lead good lives. They wanted them to be happy and content. They wanted them to support the pharaoh. And at the end of his life, the pharaoh would go and join the other gods. As I said, this was a pretty optimistic society, all right? And at first, before Egypt began to really engage in wars of their own and have more of a slave population, a lot of their original workers that worked on large public monuments, including not just the pyramids, but even the irrigation systems that went into place, were farmers who might work for a period of time away from their farm and then return. But of course, later that will change. All right. And of course, remember those intermediate periods? After a period of unrest, we get into the Middle Kingdom. A lot of political reforms here. The pharaohs begin to see themselves more as stewards of the people, shepherds of the people, and rather than gods who are about to ascend. If you've ever seen pictures or been to any of the museums with the statues of the ancient pharaohs, you might notice they hold a crook and a flail. The flail is like this little whip thing almost. That was to show that he enforced the laws, that he was the arbiter of justice. The crook, on the other hand, it's a shepherd's crook, was to show he was a shepherd leading his people. And that's why so many of these pharaohs are portrayed with one of these symbols of authority in each hand, usually resting like this over their chest. It's to show that they're the ruler and they are responsible for the people. And of course, more and more pyramids spring up. Interestingly, at first, only the very wealthy pharaohs were entombed in these, in these pyramids, and only they went through all of the procedures to be mummified. But later, in the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, a number of the wealthy nobles and merchants also began to make plans for their afterlife. And they also began to be mummified. The Book of the Dead is a bunch of spells that were supposed to help you on your afterlife. They would write these little things into your bandages and wrap you as they mummified you. So, and then they had another book, a golden book, Book of Life. All right. And of course, when we get to the New Kingdom, all right, the Hyksos came from far away. Somehow, Egypt has some wonderful natural barriers to keep people out. They have the cataracts, these waterfalls. They have, of course, the desert on the one side. The Hyksos, however, did cross in and did actually try to conquer Egypt. And after that, the Egyptians, once they expelled the Hyksos from their territory and took their horses, which made their horses faster and stronger, they began a campaign of colonization and expansion. They conquered Nubia. They plundered it for ivory from the animals, gold from the mines, and they took the people as slaves. Curiously, another neighboring society springs up later out of this, Kush, and they model themselves on the Egyptians. You would think they would want to get rid of Egyptian ways, but they actually apparently admired them enough to model themselves on them. But for many, many years, Nubia was under Egyptian control. And Palestine and Syria also were colonized. And all of these kings took all of these spoils of war and built large temple complexes to honor their gods. All right, and then here's somebody we really have to talk about. This is Amenhotep, who changes his name to Akhenaten. Now, if you've seen the Mummy movie, again, not a very historically accurate one, but you might remember Anaxinamun, the love interest of the Mummy character before he becomes mummified. The Brendan Fraser movie. So, anyway, Anaxinamun was actually the daughter of Akhenaten, Amenhotep, and you might know her more famous brother, Tutankhamun. All right, Amenhotep, usually most pharaohs had a piece of their name who reflected one of their gods. Amenhotep went from polytheism to a failed monotheism. That is the worship of one god. We believe he might have come in contact with the Hebrews, and this may have sparked this, or it might have been a way to limit the priest's power because the priests were getting very powerful and very rich. And whether it was the one or the other, we do know this. He moves the capital. He insists everybody worship the Aten, the sun disk, and he leads a failed attempt at monotheism. After his death, his son, King Tut, moves back to the regular capital, reinstates polytheism, and is murdered shortly thereafter. One last fun fact, if you will, about this is his sister, who was also his wife, sent out a cry for help. We have found one of her letters in another king's library, collection of letters, and it says that if he comes and frees Egypt, she will agree to marry him. This is a big concession. It was still believed that the pharaohs were divine, and the reason they married their closest siblings or closest relatives was in a way to preserve the divinity. Many ancient cultures would marry their women off in order to have more diplomatic ties with other countries, but the Egyptians kept their ladies at home, which sparked a lot of resentment because they didn't want to release the divinity to others. So, interestingly, for her to offer this, she must have been desperate, and recent discoveries have revealed that Tut was indeed murdered. So if you ever get a chance, you may want to look at that. Now, leaving Egypt and Sumer, who of course at this point were, shall we say, the biggest kids on the block, we are looking very briefly at some of the smaller civilizations. The Hittites We don't know a lot about them, other than what we have in the Old Testament of the Bible and their own records, all right? But what we do know is the Hittites gave something to civilization: iron. They figured out how to take this very difficult to work with metal and make weapons out of it. Iron is very difficult to work with. You need to heat it at very high temperatures. It needs to be constant. You need to remove impurities, otherwise it becomes very brittle. It's not really good for anything. They figured out how to make iron weapons. Everybody else was using bronze. So they began to lead, if you will, the ancient arms race. So if you remember nothing else about the Hittites, remember this: they created and gave us iron weapons. Again, just remember, people are going to be going where life can be sustainable. They're going to rivers, all right? They're looking for a comfortable climate if possible. We need to talk about trade and commerce. Egypt traded with itself. Sumer traded with itself. Slowly but surely, we begin to see the rise of trade. More and more nations are trading with each other. There's, believe it or not, some actual attempts at diplomacy. Marriages were conducted at some points in order to preserve the peace. All right, a lot of people went on the move. They migrated. If their current situation wasn't very good, they would pack up and they would keep moving until they found something. All right. Now, I'm not so worried about some of these slides. I'm just trying to give you more of the historical background right now, just so you feel comfortable. I want to draw your attention to this great temple. As you can see, it's crafted out of stone. All right, most of our building blocks were pretty simple. It was mud and straw, stone, as tools got better and better, you know, especially once we got iron tools rather than the original stone tools of the earliest civilizations. So limestone will be used, marble will be used. All right, and of course, note the out of Africa thesis I'd mentioned earlier. See how we've traveled out. We travel everywhere. Now, originally there were land bridges. That's how people migrate into North and South America. It's how they get to Australia. And of course, over time, these land bridges disappear. And of course, the people left behind continue, and they've lost touch with, you know, anybody they might have known. But at this point, you know, probably they didn't, you know, travel as much going back. So just something to think about if you look at how we migrate. And of course, we're all looking for the same things: food, water, shelter. And here, besides writing, is one of the other things that differentiates us from everything else on the planet. We can write, we can speak, we have language, and we also have art. Now, Lascaux, France. When these were found in the 1800s, they were found by a little girl who looked up and pointed and told her papa to look. And he couldn't believe it. When these were first found, people thought it was a hoax. They were like, you must have painted these. These are in perfect shape. Unfortunately, though, we have to worry about these things because now so many people have visited the caves that their breathing and the changes in the temperature have been, shall we say, difficult to, you know, keep them in pristine condition. But as you can see, there's a lot of movement here. There's a lot of action in the way the animals are portrayed. We don't know why they were made. We don't know if they were made to, you know, be good luck for the hunt, to celebrate a hunt, whatever it happens to be. We do know that these pieces of art are, you know, were preserved. They were important, but we don't know why. But throughout our history, writing and art differentiate us. Writing and art differentiate cultures. And of course, we also have one of the Venuses, if you will, where, you know, the Venus of Willendorf, where we have fertility figures. But this is the oldest, one of the oldest pieces of art showing human figure, which predates, you know, some other pieces of art, and interestingly is not showing a fertility figure as so many of the other ones are. So still, again, we have no reason to know why these things were created. Another one of history's mysteries, if you will. And of course, you know, we will be looking at maps. You know, do keep a watch through your book. As you can see, we're seeing how different civilizations come into being. And of course, each one has different food, different customs, different language. And here is our Fertile Crescent, where it all began. And if it wasn't for the science of irrigation employed by both Sumerians and Egyptians, it wouldn't have been such a thriving society. Irrigation was key in helping. And of course, water rights, even in the American Old West, we're worried about. So, you know, our needs haven't changed. And this is another one of the city-states of Sumer. As you can see, they had lovely artwork. Oh, and of course, note the chariots and the horses. As I said, they're starting to go to war. They're going to war with chariots, and the Egyptians will do the same. Here's Hammurabi's empire, and of course, Sumerian civilization. Sargon will become the first emperor who will conquer the bulk of the Sumerian city-states, the Mesopotamian city-states, and set himself up as emperor and create the Akkadian Empire. Hammurabi's stelae, where he put the laws for all to see. As you can see, more stelae. And this is a form of cuneiform. If you're interested, I think there are some links on YouTube. You can actually learn how to make your own cuneiform tablet out of like Play-Doh with, believe it or not, chopsticks work really well. They're very similar to the reeds that the Sumerians would have used. And, you know, you can actually learn how to write your name. So just something if you are finding yourself with nothing to do. So, and of course, as you can see, this is Egyptian civilization, and you can see how long the Nile is. You can see that little ribbon of green running through. That's all of Egypt, and it was a very optimistic, very happy society. The river gave them news, the river gave them life, and they used jewelry. They also used cosmetics, and I don't know if you know this, but they were very, very fastidious. They often shaved their hair off because lice were a problem. Lice could actually burrow into your skin, so the Egyptians prided themselves on being clean, and one way to stay clean was to shave, and then they wore wigs. And here we are, the Book of the Dead, as I mentioned before. It has a number of spells, and it shows how to prepare for the afterlife. And as you can see, they have hippopotamuses that, you know, would wait to devour you. So you definitely want your ma'at to be well balanced. And of course, the pyramids and the Hittite Empire, which I'm not as worried about. As I said, worry more about the fact they gave us iron. But do review the slides. Art does help us to understand a little bit more about the worldview of people. Where are they coming from? What was important to them? As you can see, the art's rather two-dimensional in Egypt. And of course, now you can also see that, you know, people had spread out. They had gone to what would become Spain, become England, France, Germany, and of course set up their own small societies. part of the problem with Europe was because it was so forested. It was very hard to have large holdings. You would cut down as many trees as you could, establish a small dwelling. And of course, Stonehenge is a megalith, and this is one of the characteristics of these societies that are springing up outside of Sumer, outside of Egypt. The megaliths now, we believe, were done in order to tell when the equinox was coming, how to, what time was conducive for planting. It might have had astrological or religious significance. Again, because we have no written record, we're still trying to puzzle these things out. Megaliths, by the way, mean large stone. And of course, most of these are made out of stone. There's also the White Horse on the cliffs of Dover, which was carved out. And of course, we have our timeline. So take a look at that when you have a few minutes. And that's it. So I hope this brief overview helped you. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me. And I hope you have a great day. All right. So on that note, take care, be well, and I will see you again soon when we talk about Chapter 2. Bye.